Hello everyone, Douglas here, and welcome to my Doctor Who review, and today I will be reviewing Rise of the Cybermen in the Age of Steel. This story is the first one to be written by Tom MacRae, and this story is the first story for the Cybermen in the new series, and the last time we saw the Cybermen was in 1988 in the 7th Doctor story, Silver Nemesis. This story is the first one to be directed by Graham Harper, and you might remember him because he directed the 5th Doctor's last story, The Caves of Androzani, and the 6th Doctor story, Revelation of the Daleks. I remember when I was a kid, I was happy to hear the Cybermen were coming back to the show. In part 1 called Rise of the Cybermen, our cold open scene begins in a lab, and we see a scientist is working on something, and we can't see it because of the bright light, and we see John Lumick played by Roger Lloyd Pack. We hear the thing speaks. I love John Lumick's line when he says, "And how will you do that from beyond the grave?" And we see John Lumick orders the thing to kill the scientist. And we see John Lumick tells his captain to set course for Great Britain. Our opening scene begins in the TARDIS, and we see the 10th Doctor played by David Tennant, Rose played by Billie Piper, and Mickey played by Noah Clarke, and we see them talking. We see the TARDIS console explode, and the TARDIS falls out from the vortex. We find out from the Doctor the time vortex is gone, and the TARDIS crash lands. We find out from the Doctor the TARDIS is dead, and the Doctor can't fix it. So you might think, is he going to be stuck on Earth for a while? I like the Doctor's line when he says, "We're in some sort of no place, the silent realm, the lost dimension," and we hear Mickey says, otherwise known as London. We find out the TARDIS crash landed in London, one of the great shots when we see the Zeppelins, and we find out from the Doctor that this is not our world. This is a parallel world. We find out that Rose's dad, Pete, is still alive. We see Rose touches the board, and we hear Pete says, "Trust me on this." When you look back on Father's Day, her dad was not a successful businessman, but in the parallel world, he is a successful businessman. We see the Doctor tells Rose that is not her father. We cut to a scene at a mansion, and we see Pete played by Sean Dingwall, and we see Jackie played by Camille Cottery, and they are getting ready for Jackie's birthday party. We see Jackie is calling her Rose, and you might be wondering, what does Rose look like in the parallel world? Well, here is a funny answer. She is a dog. And I find it so funny. We see John Lumick is calling Pete, and we find out John Lumick wants to meet with Pete. We see John Lumick is getting information for tonight's party, and one of the best scenes I like is when we see Jackie has the cyber ears. We see John Lumick is contacting Mr. Crane, played by Colin Spur, and he needs extra stuff. We cut to a scene in the TARDIS, and a good line from the Doctor when he says, "Parallel world is like a gingerbread house." We see Rose is watching the news on her phone, and we hear Torchwood. We see the Doctor notices a light, and we find out he has power. We see a truck backing up, and on the trailer we see International Electromatics, which is a reference to the 2nd Doctor story, The Invasion. We see Mr. Crane is offering the homeless food, and we see Jake played by Andrew Hayden Smith, and he is trying to warn someone but fails. We do see that Rose did research on Pete. We see that Rose wants to see her parallel parents, and we see Mickey goes on his own adventure. We see John Lumick's Zeppelin has arrived, and we see Pete and the President of Great Britain played by Don Warrington. So, what is the government system in this parallel world? So, is England controlled by Congress and Senate, and the US is controlled by Parliament and Prime Minister? Huh, That's an interesting thought when you think about it. We see Mickey is walking, and he is stopped by soldiers. We see the Doctor and Rose are walking and talking, and everyone is frozen. And we find out it's the earpods, and we see everyone laughing, and they go back to normal. We see Mickey is visiting his parallel grandma. We see Mickey's parallel grandma calls him Ricky. We see a blue van pose up, and we see Jake takes Mickey. We find out from Mrs. Moore, played by Helen Griffin, that International Electromatics is a dummy company owned by Cybus Industries. We find out from Jake that Mickey is now London's most wanted. We see Pete and the president are meeting with John Lumick about his pitch, and the president doesn't want his pitch. We find out from John Lumick that he is dying. We see the homeless people are under control by the earpods. One of the dark and disturbing scenes is when we see the homeless people are getting upgraded, and we hear The Lion Sleeps Tonight by Tight Fit. We see that Jake and his crew arrived at their base, and they are greeted by Ricky. I love Ricky's line when he says, "What am I doing here? What am I doing there?" And that is such a good plot twist. We see the Doctor and Rose are dressed as waiters. We see Rose sees her parallel parents. I love the Doctor's reaction when he sees Rose as a dog. We see John Lumick has arrived at the factory. We see Mickey is stripped to his underwear. We find out from Ricky they are the preachers, and we find out that John Lumick is the target. We see Jake and his crew are following the truck. We see the Doctor notices the laptop, and he is going to try and find out some information. We see Rose is talking to Pete, and we see Pete mentions Torchwood. We see Ricky and Jake are watching the truck, and we find out from Mrs. Moore that Pete is one of John Lumick's henchmen. We see that something is marching out of the truck. We see the Doctor is watching the pitch. We see Rose is talking to Jackie, and we see the talk doesn't go well. We see the floodlights go on, and we hear marching. After the Doctor is done watching the video, he knows something is up. I love the reveal, and it is out of focus, and a good line from the Doctor when he says, "It's happening again. I've seen them before." And the camera gets into focus, and we see the new design of the Cybermen, and we see the Cybermen break the glass. We see John Lumick is calling the president. I love how Rose is asking the Doctor about the Cybermen, and this could be any new fan's introduction to the Cybermen, because they don't know who the Cybermen are. We find out from the Cybermen that they will be getting a free upgrade, and if you don't accept the offer, you will get deleted. We see the Cyberman kills the president, and the Cybermen kill the party guests. We see the Doctor and Rose escape through a window, and we see Pete escapes as well. We see a Cyberman is after Jackie, and she hides in the basement. We see Ricky and Jake, and they are surrounded by Cybermen. We see the Doctor tells the Cybermen they surrender, and we find out from the Cyberman they are rogue elements, and the Doctor is trying and fails, and we see the Cybermen are going to kill everyone, and we hear the Cyberman says, "Delete, delete, delete, delete." And this is the first time we hear their battle cry, and that is the end of part 1, and that is a good cliffhanger. In part 2, called The Age of Steel, we see the Doctor has the energy source from the TARDIS, and he burns the Cybermen, and we see everyone runs into the van. We see Jackie is hiding in a closet, and we see 2 Cybermen are on guard. We find out that Pete has been working with Jake and his gang behind Lumick's back. We find out that Ricky is London's most wanted for parking tickets. most wanted for parking tickets? I find that so funny. We see John Lumic activates the earpods, and everyone is under control. We see Mr. Crane resist the control of the earpods. We find out if you take the earpods off while inactive, it will cause a brainstorm. I love Rose's line when she says, "I've seen Cybermen before." And you might remember back in Dalek, she did see a Cyberman head. We see the Cybermen are going after the Doctor and his friends. We see the Cybermen are coming after Mickey and Ricky. We see the Cybermen are surrounding the Doctor and his friends, and the Doctor pulls his sonic screwdriver, and the Cybermen march away. We see the citizens have arrived at the factory. We see Ricky is stopped by a fence. We see Ricky climbs, and he is dead, and Mickey runs away. We see the Cybermen have captured Mr. Crane. We see Mr. Crane destroys John Lumic's life support system, and he is dead. We see the Cybermen are going against John Lumic's will, and he is going to get upgraded. We see Mickey is reunited with the Doctor and his friends. We find out that Rose and Pete are going through the main door to look for Jackie. We find out the transmitter is coming from the Zeppelin. We find out that Jake is going to take out the transmitter. We find out the Doctor and Mrs. Moore are going through the cooling tunnels. The plan is to attack on 3 sides, above, between, below. And that is a reference to the 5 Doctors. I love Mickey's line when he says, "No, those days are over." And it shows that he is not going to be the Tin Dog, and he is going with Jake. We see the Doctor and Mrs. Moore are in the cooling tunnels, and we find out there are Cybermen there, but they are dormant. We see Rose and Pete put on the fake earpods, and they are with the citizens. We see Mickey and Jake are on top of the roof, and they see 2 guards, and they are going to take them out. We see Mickey and Jake knock out the guards, and they are going to take out more guards. Back in the cooling tunnels, we see the Doctor and Mrs. Moore are talking. We find out from Mrs. Moore that Mrs. Moore is not her real name. She got it from a book. We find out that Mrs. Moore's real name is Angela Price. We find out the Doctor and Mrs. Moore triggered the system, and the Cybermen detect their movement. One of the creepy scenes is when we see the Cyberman's arm move, and they are waking up. We see the Doctor and Mrs. Moore are safe. We see Rose and Pete have made it to the conversion chamber. And one of the scariest scenes is when we see the conversion process. We see Pete asks Rose if she sees Jackie, and we see a Cyberman notices Pete. We see the Cyberman asks to confirm it is Pete Tyler. We find out the Cyberman used to be Jackie Tyler, and that is freaky. Well, at least it's not our Jackie, and talk about a cold 40th birthday. We see Rose and Pete are taken to cyber control. We see Mickey and Jake knocked out all the guards. We find out there is a dormant Cyberman on board. We see the Doctor and Mrs. Moore are walking, and they are caught by a Cyberman. And we see Mrs. Moore throw something, and the Cyberman is dead. We find out from Mrs. Moore that was an electromagnetic bomb. We see the Doctor is doing an autopsy of the Cyberman. We see the Doctor discovers the emotional inhibitor. We find out the Cyberman is not dead, and it is still alive. And it asks the question, "Why am I cold?" We find out from the Doctor they broke the inhibitor. And that scene was so heartbreaking. We find out from the Doctor the key to defeating the Cybermen is the emotional inhibitor. We see Mrs. Moore stands up, and she is killed by a Cyberman, and the Doctor is taken to cyber control. We see Mickey finds the transmitter control box, and the plan is to crash the Zeppelin. We see the Doctor is reunited with Rose and Pete. We find out that John Lumic has been upgraded to Cyber Controller, and we see the Cyber Controller, and that is a cool design. And the line I like when Lumic says, "This is the Age of Steel, and I am its creator." Back at the Zeppelin, the Cyberman is activated, and we see Mickey is baiting the Cyberman, and it destroys the transmission, and everyone is back to normal. We find out from Lumic that he has factories waiting on 7 continents. If the earpods have failed, then the Cybermen will take humanity by force. And another good line from Lumic when he says, "London has fallen. So shall the world." I love the Doctor's line when he says this to Lumic. "Imagination, what about that? The one thing that led you here. Imagination, you're killing the dead." I think the Doctor has a good point with this because without imagination, the Cybermen wouldn't exist. We see Lumic offers the Doctor to be upgraded, and a good reply when the Doctor says, "You might as well kill me." We see Mickey is typing in the code. We see Mickey sends the code to Rose, and he plugs the phone into the computer, and the Cybermen are defeated. We see a Cyberman sees himself in the mirror, and the Doctor says, "I'm sorry." We see the Doctor, Rose, and Pete are escaping the factory. We see that Mickey is not leaving his friends behind, and he tells Rose to go to the roof. We see Lumic is going after the Doctor, Rose, and Pete. We see that Mickey notices a handle and a ladder comes out. I love the line when Mickey says, "Welcome to Mickey Smith Airlines. Please enjoy your flight." We see Lumic is on the ladder, and we see the Doctor gives Pete the sonic screwdriver, and we see Pete uses it, and Lumic falls to his death. We are back at the TARDIS, and the TARDIS comes back to life. We see Rose is saying goodbye to Pete. We find out that Mickey is staying behind, and we see Mickey is saying goodbye to the Doctor and Rose. We see our version of Jackie, and see here's the TARDIS, and see is reunited with Rose. I love Mickey's line when he says, "With all those cyber factories out there, so you think there'll be one in Paris? Then let's go and liberate Paris." Another good line from Mickey when he says, "I want to save the universe with a big yellow truck." And that is the end. I will say, this is a great introduction to the Cybermen, and it is a classic. I will say, it was a great idea to bring back the Cybermen. I will say, Mickey has a great character arc in this story, and it shows he is not the Tin Dog, and he was the hero in this story. And you might be wondering, is this Noel Clarke's last story? Don't worry, it's not, but we will see him again in the Series 2 finale. Let's talk about Noel Clarke. He gives a great performance, and he is great as both Mickey and Ricky. And when you look at Ricky, he is tough, and Mickey is just soft. I do love Mrs. Moore's character, and she was good. I do like John Lumic played by Roger Lloyd Pack, and he is a real menacing villain. The script by Tom MacRae is great, the music by Maury Gold is epic, and the direction by Graham Harper is great, and I will give Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel a 10 out of 10. So that is my review of Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and I will see you next time for my review of The Idiot's Lantern.